Okay, I'm sure there's more people that are going to join, but I think it's a good time to get started. So, welcome everyone to today's seminar. This is actually a joint session between the EHPS Habit Special Interest Group and the Conceptualization, Formalization, and Measurement SIG. And our question today is, what is a habit and how should we measure it? And as you can see, this is far from a settled question. Habits are studied across many fields: health psychology, behavioral neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, behavioral economics. And not only do definitions differ between these fields, they also often differ within them too. There are different, rich, and ongoing debates in the literature about how habit should be defined, whether it's the behavior or the mechanism, whether it's goal-directed or goal-independent, and how our measurement tools map onto these different conceptions. So there's real work to be done here. And luckily, we have three excellent speakers to tackle this question. So we have Gjalt-Jorn Peters, who will open by introducing decentralized contract taxonomies and narrative response models. Then we have Gardner and Massimo Köster, who will each present their perspectives on habit, and we'll use the remaining time for discussion. So please leave your questions for the end, or maybe put them in the chat when they come up so we can discuss at the end. And yeah, as I already mentioned, this session is being recorded. So I'm going to hand over to you, Gjalt-Jorn, now.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay. So welcome for the kickoff. This is a little bit longer than the other two contributions because I'm covering two topics, both the conceptual clarification in general and validity related issues in general, which of course both also apply to habit. The slides are already online. I will show this slide again at the end, so you don't have to store this now. If you want to get the slides, you can also get it later. So as you may know, and I guess everybody will be aware of this now, there has been or is still ongoing a reproducibility crisis, which the field responded to quite strongly with a lot of methodological improvements, but it also caused us to reflect on more measurement-related and theoretical issues. These reflections, to a degree, have been ongoing for the past decades already, and they're kind of known as the jingle-jangle fallacy, where basically every time we look at measurement instruments for a given construct or for related constructs, it turns out that measurement instruments that supposedly measure the same construct have content that's so different that it's very unlikely that they measure the same construct, and the other way around. Measurement instruments for different but related constructs like conscientiousness and grit quite often turn out to be so identical that they probably pretty much measure the same thing. This is a very cool study by Eiko Fried, where it's mostly actually cool because of the amazing visualization, where he looked at 7 depression measurement instruments that are used quite a lot. And he looked at the symptoms that they measure. And every spoke in this wheel is a symptom of depression that's measured by at least one of these measurement instruments. And every circle, every wheel is a different measurement instrument. So as you'll see here, there are actually not 2 measurement instruments that measure the same thing that depression is supposedly. So whether you're classified as depressed or not in a given study with, for example, insomnia, depends on whether that happens to be a symptom according to the questionnaires they happen to use in that study. This, of course, will, as you can easily see, I hope, manifest as reproducibility problems, because, of course, you are actually looking at different things in different studies. This is also related to the methods that we use to validate measurement instruments. As I guess most of you know, generally when you teach statistics and methodology, we have reliability and validity. And the idea of reliability is that it's pretty much the opposite of error. So the more reliable your measurements, the more accurate your data will be. And validity is whether you're actually on target, whether you actually measure what the measurement instrument was designed to measure, which of course is not a given. The traditional methods we use to validate measurement instruments, to actually look at whether they measure what they're supposed to measure, have some room for improvement in this respect. So, and this is a very nice study by Andrew Moll, where he took the growth mindset scale, which you see here on the screen, and then he applied the normal validation machinery that we use. Then he replaced intelligence in the scale with gavagai, which is a nonsense word. He also used 2 or 3 other nonsense words to make sure that this one didn't happen to have some meaning or connotation for some people. And again, he found that actually it performed quite well if you look at the regular validation statistics. Then he went a step further and replaced all the items with lorem ipsum text with an audience, participants that did not speak Latin, for the record. And then again, he achieved a very high Chromas alpha. A single factor explained a lot of variance. So basically, if you apply the normal validation machinery, you'd conclude that actually this measurement instrument was valid. Then he omitted all the text from the items and he just presented numbers to people. 1 second, I'm suddenly realizing nobody on my screen is moving. Are you all still there? Is everybody just sitting very silently?
Yeah, we're here.
Okay.
Yes.
Very good. Then for some reason, Teams just doesn't update. Thank you. I thought maybe this is more shocking than I had anticipated, but apparently it's not that bad. So he omitted the actual text in the items. And then he still found like a very good Chromas alpha, and still the item total loadings, correlations, and the factor loadings were all very acceptable. So basically, this scale with 0 items was found to be valid. This is a pattern that you see more widely. In this study, they compared like I think 15 measurement instruments that were used quite a lot in social psychology. And they looked whether the factor loadings were the same in different groups of participants, which is a requirement for it to actually measure the same thing in different people with different ages, different genders. And they found that actually it didn't. So all these instruments are actually invalid if you look slightly more deeply than the general methods we use. Need for cognition was an exception. So that's apparently a scale that you can use quite safely. One of the things that confuses this is that quite often people use the methods that you can use for reflective measurement models when actually they have a formative model. This will come back a bit later. And we tend to just use sum scores, even though factor loadings for items can vary quite a bit. Based on all these things, some people argued that construct validity theory that we use as the basis for these methods is actually not valid. It doesn't actually work. And this argument is based partly on the nomological net, which was a trick that was used with construct validity theory to be able to say something about validity, where the idea is that we have a network of constructs, and the meaning of the constructs is kind of fixed by how it relates to the other constructs. So you have laws that tell us how the constructs relate to each other, and this then allows us to test simultaneously these laws, this nomological network, and the validity of our measurement instruments. And if it checks out, everything is valid, and the nomological net works, like 2 words. But if it doesn't check out, then we have a problem and something is wrong. The idea is that these laws are like functions, like they're kind of deterministic. They're not just correlations. This wouldn't work with correlations. But that's kind of what we do. As they argue, Boschbaum et al., this has actually never really successfully been done. And in psychology, it was also a bit problematic, which Cronbach and Meal tried to sidestep. But they failed to sidestep that, apparently. So the problem is that the psychometric approaches we use don't really have a lot of diagnostic value. So basically, validation is just a process that you apply, and in the end, you have a valid measurement instrument. But you don't actually look at whether it measures what it's supposed to measure. They argue that ideally, validation should look at whether something measures what it's supposed to measure, just like other fields do. So, for example, when you have a thermometer, we have a theory that says that liquid expands as temperature increases. So we create a glass container, we put some liquid in it, and then we can use distance to measure temperature. This was discussed in this more philosophy of science themed book, where basically the idea is that this is a process called epistemic iteration. And this epistemic iteration consists of updating your theory, updating your measurement instruments, updating your theory, updating your measurement instruments, which is kind of the opposite of what we do in psychology, where we kind of, when reviewers often remind us to use a validated measurement instrument from the 80s rather than something new. In the end of construct validity, they argue that we should look at the thing we have to measure and look at how it actually how the measurement instrument measures that specific thing. Of course, that doesn't really leave us much to go on, because everything we learned, at least everything I learned, is just the normal validation machinery. However, they did this once. So I looked for this paper, and there they actually did look at how the measurement instrument works for a given construct. But the paper looked like this. And for me personally, I kind of disengaged at that point. And that's because they argued that this requires the best formal models that mathematical psychology has to offer, which is a bit of a problem because all our theories are mostly qualitative, narrative. But there's actually a solution somewhere. Like, we already have these measurement models, right? A reflective measurement model is what we usually use, where we assume that something exists in our mind and it causes the scores on the items. You can also have a formative model, like you use for socioeconomic position, where we actually create the construct from the item scores, but it very clearly does not exist. That's not a claim we make. And then you have the newer network approaches, where there is no actual construct in your mind. But we usually have this reflective measurement model. Now, these reflective measurement model are basically based on the assumption that if you have this strong causal model of how those item scores are caused by the construct, then you can do factor analysis, confirmatory factor analysis. You can look at internal consistency. All these things we do require this strong causal model that you see visualized on the left side. So that means in all those cases, whenever you do a factor analysis or compute an internal consistency, that means you have an idea of how the construct causes the responses to those items. And we usually discuss this in terms of the response process. And the idea of response process is that people perceive some stimuli, then there's this response process, and that produces the response. So basically, the response process is everything in between stimulus perception and the production of the response. This has been studied a lot, mostly in demographic questions, basically people trying to measure unemployment numbers, stuff like that. And they've been studying it mostly to make sure that the questions are clear. So they use a think aloud method, where participants are asked to fill out the questionnaire and think aloud while they do it, combined with probes, where you just ask people specific questions that you prepare. The idea is, if you want to have a valid measurement instrument, that people observe a question, an item, then there is some process, and the target construct is involved in the process and produces the response. Alternatively, for Bobby here, they also perceive the item, but their response process is different. And actually, their response is not caused by the target construct. So the idea is, of any measurement, that if we want to make an inference about a construct from an item, that construct has to determine participants' responses to the item. If you have a given item and you cannot explain how it is processed and how in that process the target construct causes the response, then there's no reason to assume that magically somehow you still can infer something about the construct. It kind of boils down to this comic that people may know, where if you don't know how an item would work, but you still say that it measures what it's supposed to measure, you basically assume that's because of a miracle. And that's kind of what we do a lot. We have these questionnaires, then there's a miracle, we have these data, and then we say, aha, it's valid because of some correlations or something. But we often don't explain how we know it is valid, why the item works as it works. So the idea is, what you can do is that you use narrative response models, where you basically just describe how it works. And that's your theory of measurement, which can be super rudimentary at first, and you can extend it later. And the nice thing about this approach is that you no longer need correlations to base your validity claims on. So that means you can use it to study validity of single items. It's also not quantitative or qualitative, it's just doing science using whichever methods you need. And it allows for diversity. You can study much better where items work the same for people or don't. A challenge is that you really need to know what you're talking about. So I started doing this with a colleague of mine, Rick, here in Leuven on the writing week. And we did writing during the days, and in the evenings, according to a famous Flemish saying, we epistemically iterated, and we basically worked on creating a narrative response model for one item for self-efficacy. That took us a few evenings, because as it turns out, they are kind of long. You don't have to read this. There's no test. I'm mostly showing this to show that they can be quite extensive. And they have three parts. First, we describe how people process the item to comprehend it, how they process the language and stuff. Then you discuss how the construct we want to measure is involved in the process. And then finally, how people produce the response. Here, we make a number of judgment calls. For example, as you see in orange here, we decided that the weighting of separate self-efficacy estimates for different sub-behaviors, the aggregation happened through weighting with a sigmoid algorithm. So if people had a higher self-efficacy for a subskill that didn't linearly accumulate with the other weight estimates, but using a sigmoid, like on the right here, which of course is it's something you can quite easily study. And it's also something you can quite easily disagree with, which of course is kind of the point, because that's how we can learn stuff. We learned a number of things in the process. First, to think about how something works requires us to actually think about the human psyche. And to our dismay, that's not actually something we normally do a lot in our work. That also means we're not actually very good at this. We kind of went back to some bachelor level stuff about how memory works and stuff like that. We also learned that actually if you measure something, you kind of have to think about how people use it when they behave in a certain way, because of course that's what you have to mimic in the measurement. And we found that it's super useful with then finding out that your construct definition actually doesn't really work if you work it out. Once you have one of these, you can start studying them. So you have people, take Alex and Bobby again, who answer an item, and then maybe something goes wrong in the process as you designed it. But then also potentially it can be fixed later on in the process and you might still get a valid measurement. But it's also possible that actually the measurement is not valid because you see that the way a person processes an item doesn't actually involve the target construct anymore. Then if you study this, you get an idea of the heterogeneity you have. And even in advance, based on the narrative response model, you can think about where you would expect more heterogeneity between people in their response processes. And then you can prepare verbal probes, for example, if you want to study it using cognitive interviews. And then you just study and you iterate, updating your narrative response model and your item and your construct definition, etc., until you have something better. So in this way, narrative response models can kind of fill the hole that is currently filled with an appeal to a miracle. But the core is, for this epistemic iteration, that you really have to know what you're talking about. So if you look at habit, for example, and we look at the APA Dictionary of Psychology, this is what we see. Which is a bit minimal, one could argue, for something that we can't actually observe and that we'll want to study and make inferences about. Relatively situation specific is also not very specific. And if we look in the behavior change intervention ontology and we type in habit, habit itself does not exist, but we have a number of other constructs like habitual behavior, which again has a one-sentence definition. Habit learning, learned stimulus behavior co-occurrence. So we have some related constructs, but they all have very, very short definitions that use related concepts in the definition. This is not unique to habit. Actually, all these construct definitions tend to be quite short. If you look at all the constructs in the ontology, the median and mean length is 15 or 16 words. And that's not because they actually didn't make an effort. They actually went back to the original authors in a number of rounds, up to 7 rounds, as you see in this table, to really make sure that everybody thinks these are good definitions. But still, they end up with these really short ones. A few years ago at the EHPS in Bremen, Jutta Matta also presented this for social aspects, and there she also found that these are quite vaguely defined. And the problem here is that what we study is basically our brain, which has a lot of neurons with a lot of connections. So many so that actually we can't even analyze all this data for one person for a few weeks. We can't even store that amount of data. There's a very nice chapter by Irone and Brinkman where they discuss why actually a neuroscientific perspective can never really help us understand human behavior. What we use instead is that we use constructs, which are defined as a higher level. The problem with constructs is that they're not natural kinds. When you want to measure the boiling point of water, I could give each of you a thermometer now. You could even pick your own. You could go anywhere on Earth to measure the boiling point of water. And you'd all come back with roughly the same thing, even though you might have slightly different definitions of the boiling point, like, when you see the first bubble or where you have a certain amount of steam or whatever, you would all return with roughly 100 degrees. Nobody would return with like minus 200 degrees or plus 1,000 degrees. That's because this is just what it is on Earth. That's not the case with us. We have a brain with constructs that we kind of use. And that means that if you have different measurement instruments with different items, with different texts, they don't actually measure the same thing. And our definitions also, so different definitions of the same thing, describe different things in people's minds. This is already an optimistic picture, probably. And to make things complicated, this is actually positive. We want this diversity, this heterogeneity, because that is epistemologically powerful. Our science works better, more effectively, if we have different definitions of things. So the idea is in a study, we draw conclusions based on the analyses we do based on data that we collected using a certain method that we designed based on our theory and our ontological and epistemological stance. And then these conclusions, of course, change our theory, ideally, so that it becomes better. And we need heterogeneity at the lower levels. We need different methods, different theories, and different ontological and epistemological stances to proceed as a science. So the situation is that these constructs, like habit, are not natural kinds. No definitions, therefore, can be true or false, and we want them to be diverse. So based on this, Rick and me developed something that we call decentralized construct taxonomies, where you define a construct extensively in a definition, and you also describe how it can be measured, how you can classify measurement instruments as something that measures the thing, how you can code qualitative data, and how you can elicit qualitative data. And the idea of these is that they're accurate, detailed, consistent, and that it's okay that they're wrong, because we're using them as tools to get better and better. So they're called decentralized construct taxonomies because they're decentralized. Anybody can work on them quite easily. They're about constructs and they're taxonomies. They help you to decide what things are. And they consist of the components I just described. That's all there is, basically. There are a number of methods to develop them. The easiest one is the transparent descriptive approach, where you just say what you do. So you just write down the definition you already have in your mind. You can also copy something from a theory or combine multiple theories. You can do a scoping review to look at what others used in the literature. You can reverse engineer one or more questionnaires. You can also have a team of experts and then decide how to define something, or you can formalize that with a Delphi approach, or you can do a qualitative or a quantitative study to get to a definition. An important consideration here is that, of course, it feels quite vulnerable. Everybody has imposter syndrome, so it's quite scary for people to just define something, especially extensively. There are a number of tools we created, which I will not go into now, but they do allow you to do cool things. The most important thing to remember is that doing this is actually quite easy, because you can just fill out a spreadsheet with a number of fields, and then you have created your definition that you can then publish to people. Anybody can do this, and the nice thing is that you then have a unique reference to a given definition, and then you can do consistent research within your lab with the exact same definition of habit, but also between different labs. If you have different definitions, you can start finding out how this matters for your findings. And you can start epistemically iterating, changing your definition, changing your measurement, changing your definition, changing your measurement as they get better and better. So as you recall what we discussed about the narrative response models, those are the other half of the coin, so to speak. On the one hand, you have the definition. On the other hand, you have how you think a measurement instrument works. So what you can do if you were to be interested in how to measure habit is that you first create one of these DCT specifications with a comprehensive definition. Then you select or make an item or more. You develop one or more narrative response models. And then you study whether the narrative response model checks out, whether this is indeed how people process the item. And you can use any methods, of course, quantitative, qualitative, implicit measurements, whatever works to study the narrative response model. And then you update the definition and or the item and or the narrative response model. And then you keep iterating until it checks out and you can explain why you think your item measures habit. These are a number of links that I put here because I know that the slides will be placed online anyway. I'm sorry I went slightly over time, but I hope this was interesting and gives you a starting point for moving forward.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that's an excellent starting point. As I said in the beginning, we can leave the questions maybe for the end when we have the broader discussion. So we can move on now to Ben for the next talk.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just share my slides. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to offer not the correct definition of habit, but my definition of habit, which has come from essentially around 20 years of just scratching my head as to what this construct of habit even means. So here's my thinking on this. What is a habit? Well, essentially, there are kind of two clusters of definitions out there. There's the well, first of all, I should point out there's no correct or incorrect definition, and that we should judge our definitions, or at least this is how I've gone about it, according to how useful those definitions are. Can they be used, and for what particular purpose? So we have our lay definition. This is where if you go and speak to someone on the street about a habit they may have, they'll typically talk about something that they do. So I see this as the kind of habit as behavior perspective, or rather just a lay perspective that treats habit as a behavior that is repeated frequently. Sometimes people say it's something that they find difficult not to do, or there's an element of automaticity, but generally speaking, the lay definition is one of habit being an action that people tend to do quite frequently, or a tendency to do that action. If we're to judge that according to its usefulness, it's not very useful because it doesn't give us any explanatory value. It just relabels the behavior that you're trying to explain. So you don't get anything useful by saying that habit is a behavior that you do. If you try to use that in a predictive sense, you're saying that someone will tend to do a behavior because they have a tendency to do the behavior. So we're going to leave that definition to one side and focus on the psychological definition instead. So here is a very broad psychological definition whereby we're talking about habit as being something akin to an automatically cued behavior which arises when a cue behavior association that's been learned through a process of repeatedly doing something in a particular context. When that association is activated by encountering the cue, that tends to lead to or tends to start a process of generating a particular behavior. So this definition is useful in that it has theoretical value, and it can help us explain people's behavior, in that it says more than just habit is a behavior that people do, but habit is a behavior that people do because they have learned a cue behavior association and because that association has become activated. So essentially, there are lots of, within the habit literature, there are lots of subtle kind of variations on this. What I'm going to be arguing today is that I think it's best to see habit as a process, but there are competing ways of perceiving habit. So where within this is the habit? Well, some definitions portray the behavior that occurs as the habit. So here is a model that looks at how activation of a cue behavior association translates into behavior. You encounter the cue, that activates the association of the cue behavior association, or sometimes called stimulus response association, and that generates behavior. Now, people who say that habit should be defined as the behavior itself, they're essentially treating the behavioral output of this process as the habit. And their argument, or their perspective, is that if a behavior has been produced by the activation of this stimulus response association, it is therefore a habit. And importantly, as I understand it, from this perspective, if a habit, this behavior can only be caused by the activation of a stimulus response association in order to qualify as a habit. If it's come from any other source, it doesn't count as a habit. So this is a type of behavior. From this perspective, it's a type of behavior that's caused by the activation of a stimulus response association. And this is sometimes kind of portrayed in comparison with a goal-directed response, where rather than just this kind of simple association, people think about what the outcomes of their behavior might be and how well they'll serve their goals, and then they act on the basis of that. Now, the problem with that definition of habit as a form of behavior, well, there are several problems, but one issue that I struggle with is that if we're treating habits as behaviors that are purely generated by stimulus response associations, that's not very applicable to our everyday lives, because in the real world, often our behaviors will be driven by both stimulus response associations and goals. So imagine, for example, let's say I have a habit of when I walk into a seminar room, I sit down. The environment affords this, it enables me to sit down. So I have this very simple habit: walk into the seminar room, sit down. So there, the cue is walking into the seminar room, the behavioral response is sitting down. But what happens if I'm cued to sit down and then I can't find a chair? Well, what will happen is I'll go and find a chair and then I'll sit on the chair. So was that purely a stimulus response caused action, or was it an action that was caused by, it had stimulus response input into it, but also because I wasn't able to successfully do that, because there wasn't a chair, I had to switch to reflective processes, in which case the same behavior has occurred, but it's occurred as a result of both stimulus response associations and goals. So in this case, if that behavior happens and it's been driven at least in some way by reasoned deliberative influences, by this definition, does this still count as a habit or not? If it doesn't, then this causes a problem, because very few of our day-to-day behaviors that we do, which are quite complex, would actually fit within this definition of habit. In other words, there are very few behaviors that are purely driven by cue behavior or stimulus response associations. Another problem that arises from seeing habit as a form of behavior is that there's a great potential for misunderstanding here. So from this perspective, habit is just one subtype of automatic response. It's a response that occurs because of this learned cue behavior association. But there are other forms of automatic response. There's automatic valuations, approach avoidance tendencies, and so on. But once you start kind of moving away from, the scientific literature, we find that actually the nuances of this definition are lost. So if you look at James Clear's book, and he sold, a bajillion copies of this book, he treats tiny habits as any automatic actions. He's not solely talking about stimulus response associations. I'm not saying James Clear is right or wrong, but what I'm saying is, if this is how the public understands habit and we're treating it as something slightly different, there's room for, there's real potential for misunderstanding. And also there's potential for misunderstanding within the scientific literature itself. So if we're treating habit as behavior, this is what our diagram looks like. What we sometimes find in the behavioral science literature is that authors will say, okay, well, if habit is the behavior at the end of this process, then what are the other variables that influence habit alongside stimulus response associations? So I've seen papers, for example, where the authors have said, right, we want to understand dietary habits, and we're going to look at measuring stimulus response associations, but we're also going to look at other variables like identity. And then they find that variation in people's eating behavior, which they're calling an eating habit, is predicted, yes, by stimulus response associations, but also identity. And so it leads them to this very weird conclusion that eating habits are not purely driven by stimulus response associations. So this is just, these are some of the kind of misunderstandings that can happen if we treat habit as behavior, because actually that very narrow conceptualization of habit as being a behavior that's only caused by stimulus response associations is quickly lost when you look elsewhere in the behavioral science literature. So an alternative way that habit is sometimes seen is that some people have said, okay, let's not treat habit as the behavior, let's treat habit as the cue behavior association or the stimulus response association. So here's a definition by Steve Fleetwood. He calls the habit a cognitive representation of a cue and action response learned through repetition and activated automatically, and it tends to elicit action. Now, according to Fleetwood, that's a nice definition in that it gives us parsimony, it gives us clarity. But one of the problems within this definition is he talks about the habit as tending to elicit action, but we know that sometimes people will have stimulus response associations, but they won't act on them. So a few years back, some colleagues and I published a paper where we reanalyzed old qualitative research and found that this was among people who had successfully lost weight by changing their behavior for 6 months or more, but they were still talking about battling against kind of unwanted temptations that were caused by stimulus response associations. So in that situation, it looks like those stimulus response associations exist somewhere, but they're no longer eliciting action. So does that count as a habit or not? I don't think it does. In which case we go back and say, okay, well, let's just treat habit as the stimulus response association and get rid of that idea of, the tendency to act. But then my problem is, okay, within that diagram, if we're just treating habit as the stimulus response association, what can we say about everything else that happens around it? It doesn't tell us anything about how habits are activated, how they translate into behavior, and so on. So for this reason, I think the best way to conceive of habit itself is as this entire diagram. So habit is not just one part of this, it's the entire process whereby encountering a cue activates an association, a cue response association, which in turn generates an impulse to do the thing that the associated action, which in turn will translate into habitual behavior. So I think one of my take-home points, my main take-home point from this, is that I think we need to be clearer in our terminology. And in fact, I would argue that we should probably just more or less drop the term habit, or not use it in the way that we're currently using it, because I think habit is the overall process that describes how activation of a cue behavior association translates into impulses, which translate into action. But in terms of measurement, I think we can identify some discrete components of that I think we need to look at. So I would argue that if people are doing research in this area, they should distinguish between three key elements of this process. First of all, there's what I call the habit association. This is simply the learned stimulus response or cue behavior association. And we learn that through context consistent repetition. And we can measure that by looking at people's readiness to respond, whether that's some kind of neural activation or behavior or whatever, when they encounter the cue. And the way that this works is the habit association, when it's been activated, generates a habit impulse. What is a habit impulse? A habit impulse is a mental representation of behavior, which once it's been activated, kind of generates a drive to enact that behavior. But importantly, habit impulses don't always translate into behavior, because they can sometimes be overridden by counter impulses. In other words, if you've got a habit that's kind of pushing you to do one behavior, but you really, really don't want to do that, and you're able to control what you will do, you can override that impulse. And lastly, habitual behavior itself, which is the action that is generated by the habit process. One of the reasons I think this terminology is quite useful as well is that if we conceive of habit as being this entire process rather than just one part in this process, it really opens the doors for us to think about, how can we try and break habits? How can we change people's behavior? And my colleagues and I have done quite a bit of work now trying to map out discrete habit change strategies and identify where within this process these sit. Okay, that's everything from my perspective. Thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. So we're moving on to the final talk, which is Massimo Köster. I'm sure there's many questions, but yeah, again, we'll have a discussion at the end.
Okay, can you see my slides already, or?
Yes.
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 All right. Thanks for having me here today. And I will be talking about embracing theoretical diversity, actually, when it comes to the underlying processes of habits. And you can still see the slides, right?
Yes, they're just a little small, but maybe just for me.
Yeah, it looks like they're not filling up the full screen, but we can see the slides in principle.
Let me try to fix this quickly.
The shared screen also seems vertical for some reason.
Okay, wait a second. Let me try again. No. Okay, sorry for this hiccup.
It's okay, we're quite good on time, I think, despite me having taken too long. Perfect. Oh,
Oh,
that was it.
Now it
briefly.
was there. Oh, sorry. Okay, but now I know what's the
Yes,
trick.
that's
Now
it.
you should see it, right?
Don't breathe.
Okay. Now let's start over again. So thanks for having me. And today I'll be talking about embracing theoretical diversity regarding the underlying processes of habits. And so what do we talk about when we talk about habits? And I think many different things come to mind, which complicates the debates on habits and habit research in general. So sometimes we think of exercising routines, or maybe making our way to work without much thought, or unhealthy snacking, or typing in our old password. But with such a mixed bag of phenomena, what justifies using the same term what justifies using the same term when describing all of these phenomena? And I think another way to try and get to an answer here is to distinguish between different levels of using the term habits. So one can talk about habits on a functional level by talking about conditions under which these behaviors occur, and there might be certain conditions under which all of these different phenomena we call habits or habit-like occur, such as after extensive repetition, poor operating conditions, or that these behaviors might persist despite outcome changes. And another way to try and find common ground is indeed, as also Ben Gardner just talked about, to talk about mental processes causing these behaviors. And one mental process that has been quite predominantly described as a potential cause of habits are indeed stimulus-driven processes, whereby indeed a stimulus is taught to automatically generate an impulse towards an action based on learned stimulus-response associations. But lately there has been a debate on whether the same or many of the phenomena we consider habits can actually also be explained by goal-directed processes if we consider goal-directed processes to operate fairly automatically as well, and to potentially involve outdated outcome values or response outcome contingencies. And so I will zoom in on this debate a bit today. And before moving to the debate, just briefly want to mention that, of course, these levels, they interact. So based on the processes we assume on a mental level, we can come up with predictions on a functional level. And based on our observations on a more functional level, we can make inferences about the underlying processes. Now, moving on to the functional level, I will focus on action slips as one functional phenomena in the habit literature because I think it has been repeatedly shown. And by action slips, I mean the insensitivity to changes in response outcome contingencies. So people sometimes keep engaging in behaviors despite knowing that these behaviors are no longer effective. An example is typing in your old password despite knowing that you've changed the password. And we also know that these types of behaviors are especially likely when the behavior has been repeated many times in the past, and when we're currently facing poor operating conditions, such as when we're under time pressure, stressed, or when we have many things on our mind. And probably the first compelling evidence that action slips are indeed especially likely after extensive repetition and when under poor operating condition came from a study by Hartwig and colleagues, which has been replicated by now a couple of times. And in the study, just very briefly, participants first learned cue response mappings. So 4 different cues had to be responded to with 4 different responses. And they learned these cue response mappings either minimally or extensively. Afterwards, the cue response mapping was reversed for 2 of these stimuli, and participants had to engage in the task until they showed sufficient learning of the new contingency. And now, crucially, in the test phase, performance on these reverse trials was assessed under varying time constraints. And I think the most important finding here was that indeed, after extensive training compared to minimal training, so the red compared to the yellow line here, participants made more errors on these reverse trials within a certain window of time constraints, showing that indeed action slips are especially likely after extensive repetition and when under poor operating conditions. Okay. So now how is this explained, or how can this be explained on a mental level? And then the most common or predominant account comes from dual process models, distinguishing between stimulus-driven and goal-directed processes. And the idea is that initially behavior is goal-directed, so people might type in their password to gain access to the computer. And the idea is that if we repeatedly engage in that behavior, a strong stimulus-response association is formed. In this case, for instance, between the opening screen of the computer and typing in one's password. Now, these dual process accounts furthermore assume that strong stimulus-response associations can be processed more automatically than these response outcome contingencies, meaning they require less operating conditions, such as less time. Now, what happens after reversal, such as changing your password? The idea is that a new contingency is learned, and that is in these studies being checked with these criterion-based learning phases. And these contingencies are less automatic now than the stimulus-response associations, which in this case is still the association between the opening screen and entering the old password. And this often offers an explanation for why, under poor operating conditions, people might be especially likely to rely on that stimulus response association and make the action slip. Now, to quickly sum up, the dual process account states that repetition installs strong stimulus response associations, which can be processed more automatically, and such that after reversal and when under poor operating conditions, people rely on these associations and thereby produce errors such as action slips. Now, recently we proposed a goal-directed alternative, which rests on the idea that goal-directed processes can also operate fairly automatically and sometimes involve outdated outcome values or response outcome contingencies. So to illustrate it in a similar way, the idea is that overtraining doesn't necessarily install a stimulus response association, but maybe it strengthens the representation of that contingency. So the representation of the expectancy that typing in my password will give me access becomes stronger. This account furthermore assumes that the stronger these representations are, the more automatic they can be processed. And what happens after reversal, according to this account, is that people also install a new contingency between, in this case, typing in your password, the new password, and gaining access. But this contingency, because it has been processed less frequently in the past, cannot be processed as automatically as that old contingency. So the idea being that if a person makes an action slip, such as typing in the old password, that is due to the retrieval of this old yet strong contingency representation. To compare the two, the goal-directed account, or to sum up the goal-directed account, the idea is that repetition installs strong stimulus response outcome contingencies, and the stronger these contingency representations are, the more automatically they can be processed. And after reversal and when under poor operating conditions, action slips occur because goal-directed processes rely on old, strong stimulus response outcome contingencies. And importantly, this is a prediction that the goal-directed account makes here, right? It suggests that under the conditions under which action slips occur, old yet strong stimulus response outcome contingencies should be processed. And so there are two studies thus far that have tested this. One I will quickly try to go over that I've done with Ike together doing our PhDs. And so what we did in the study is that participants had to do these choice trials. They had to choose, they were presented with 4 differently colored pairs of doors, and had to choose the left or right door with the goal to find diamonds. And they either had to do this task extensively or moderately, so 1 day or 4-day training. So on each trial, they saw a pair of doors. They had to knock on one of them, the door opened, and they received the respective outcome, either a diamond or a rock. Afterwards, the position of the diamond was reversed for 2 of the doors. And then finally, in the test phase, we had choice trials again, but now we could compare reversed and unreversed trials. And we introduced expectancy trials, and on these trials, participants actually always saw a response. So they saw a hand knocking on one of the doors, and they had to quickly predict whether behind the door there would be a diamond or whether there would be a rock. Okay. And importantly, both of these trials were under time pressure. Now, what we found is that what you can see are the results for the choice trials in the test phase. And what we found is that after extensive training, participants made more errors on reversed than unreversed trials. Or they actually did it both in the moderate and after extensive training, but the difference was bigger in the extensive condition, suggesting that indeed extensive training results in action slips. And importantly, what we found as well is that on these expectancy trials, after extensive training, participants also made more errors on reversed relative to unreversed expectancy trials, suggesting that they not only kept, after extensive training, selecting the old location where the diamond used to be, but they also still indicated that the diamond would still be in that location. So where are we in this debate, whether habits, or in this particular case, action slips, are caused by goal-directed or stimulus-driven processes? Where when we look at the conditions under which action slips occur, actually both processes can explain the same phenomena, the same pattern. But the goal-directed account makes a prediction the stimulus-driven account wouldn't necessarily make, which is that under the conditions under which action slips occur, we would also find the retrieval of old response outcome contingencies. And this debate is far from settled, and the evidence I have briefly discussed with regard to the goal-directed account is far from conclusive. But my current view on the processes underlying habits, or in this particular case, action slips, is that we should at least be open to entertain this goal-directed idea, because it can explain the same phenomena on a functional level, and embracing a theoretical diversity holds predictive value. The goal-directed account makes predictions the stimulus-driven account wouldn't make, and it also holds heuristic value. It allows uncovering new questions, measures, explanations, or interventions. And for instance, in the context of substance use, we have written a review paper trying to outline how changing from a stimulus-driven perspective on substance use to a goal-directed perspective changes the way we might think about substance use. So if you're interested, I point you to that paper. And with that, thank you for listening. I think it was a lot of information. I hope I didn't lose everyone.
Thank you, Massimo. Okay, so let's open the floor for questions, comments, and thoughts. I should maybe say in general that this is meant to be a kickoff, actually, to kind of foster the collaboration between the Habit SIG and the CFM SIG. So obviously, yeah, it may take some time to process as well. And there was a lot of interest in this session, which is great. So we'll think about how we can keep this conversation going and maybe get something fruitful out of this, because clearly there is a lot of interest. So any questions, comments, thoughts?